The twins rose out of the mists like two blunt fingers of stone prodding at the belly of the sky. The river ran between them, iron-gray and swollen from days of rain, gnawing the wood pilings at the fairy berth. Catelyn Stark reined in beneath the portcullis and tilted her face up to the looming towers, smelling damp mortar, wet horses, the sour tang of damp wool. The banners of House Frey snapped in the soft wind, pale blue field and twin towers in white. 100 narrow windows watched them. It was not a place to invite warmth. Robb rode a length ahead, gray wind pacing him with a silent lope, the direwolf's coat dark with river mist. Robb's hair, more auburn than red now that the summer sun was gone, was flattened by the drizzle, his cloak heavy and fur-lined. He had taken the rain as if it were nothing, and Catelyn saw it settle across him as something else. The weight of what he must do, the acceptance of the shape of the duty that lay before him. They dismounted in a clatter beneath the inner gatehouse and were led through corridors made narrow by mundane clutter. Stacked barrels, coils of rope, a broken bench half-mended. The twins always felt to Catelyn like a hastily built thing. Not for lack of age, but for lack of care. Men hustled back and forth with torches. 100 faces with the sharp cheekbones and pale eyes of the same old lord stamped upon them in cheap leather. Walder Frey received them in his great hall on a chair carved to look like a throne, though it was only a high-backed thing with clawed feet. The air was warmer there and held the heavy smell of roasted meat. He had an old dog's face with the tight, wrinkled skin and a thin-lipped mouth that seemed forever prepared to bite. When he smiled, it was an exhibition of teeth. "Bread and salt," he croaked, and a serving girl darted forward with a silver tray, crusts stacked beside a dish of coarse salt. Robb took his share first, broke the bread, dipped it and swallowed. Catelyn watched his throat work. Her hand trembled only a little as she did the same. Her mouth was dry. The bread felt like dust. Grey Wind's presence at Robb's knee reassured her more than any oath could, though the direwolf's golden eyes were fixed not on Lord Walder but on the men lurking by the pillars, a pair of lean men with twin expressions of idle contempt. Freys, surely. There were more of them than there were candles. "Guest right given and taken," Robb said. His voice was steady. "Thank you for your welcome, Lord Walder." "I," Walder said. As though the words were something stolen he had to surrender under watch. He clapped, and the sharp sound echoed. "And now? Now we talk of how, if the insult was to Robb, the injury had always been to the cause." Catelyn felt the words like grit between her teeth. She looked at Robb and saw not Eddard, not the boy at Winterfell hacking at a straw man, but a man listening, weighing, measuring what must be borne. The hall murmured with the faint clink of cups and the shifting of mail. Above, along the dim galleries, Frey girls and boys peered through the rails. "You were wronged," Robb said. "I broke my word when I should have kept it. I did it for reasons that seemed sound at the time." He did not name the girl he had wed and left behind with her tears and her mother's pleading eyes, nor the wound that had led to a bed and vows sworn by a fevered boy with blood-sealed hands. "It was folly. I make amends." "How handsome an amends!" Lord Walder's eyes glittered. "Will a wolf put his forepaws on my table and beg like a hound?" Grey Wind lifted his head. Catelyn could sense the temper in Robb like the tightening of a bowstring. He steadied himself, and his next words were even. "I will keep the bargain I should have kept. I will take a Frey to wife as promised, before my banners and yours." A sigh passed through the hall, a wind through tall grass. Men glanced at each other, whispered, lifted their brows. Lord Walder's mouth flattened into something sharp-edged with pleasure. He craned his thin neck and showed the spotted underside like a filthy cloth. "Will you now? Will you indeed? One of my beauties. You will not parade them before him as if they were Maras at auction," Catelyn said, perhaps more sharply than she intended. She felt all their eyes find her. "My son is king in the north. He will be treated with the respect due him and to your daughters. He will marry a lady, not a prize. Your tongue, Lady Stark, is as bracing as old vinegar," Walder said. His gaze flicked past her, dismissing. "I have one in mind. Roslyn. She can play the harp well enough to make men sigh. She blushes prettily." never gives anyone a lick of trouble. You might like a wife who does not talk back, your grace. Robb's mouth twitched. I value counsel. Then you may counsel her to keep sweet. It will be good for you both, to have that oath bound right and tight. The phrase do not forget. No, Catelyn said very low. You do not. It was done much faster than Kate. The shape of his vengeance had been bent by this, diverted perhaps. But the river took strange turns around strong stones. Slyn Frey was small, yes, and very pale. She wore her hair coiled under a net of beads, and when she came to Robb she curtsied with a grace that came of fear or careful training. Her hands trembled only once, when the septa pronounced the words that made her a queen. Robb's gaze was steady on hers, his voice deep and certain. Catelyn listened and forced herself not to flinch. When Robb settled the marriage cloak on Roslyn's shoulders, there was a hush, and the flames on the hearth bent with a draught from the draughty passages. After the vows, when bread burst and wine spilled and music began, the hall changed into something almost merry, the relief of men who had expected blood and found only wine. Catelyn kept watch. She counted doors and the men near them. She marked Roose Bolton with his pale eyes and damp mouth, quiet as lake ice. She marked Black Walder with his cruel smile. She marked lame Lothar, clever-faced and careful. She marked, too, the fact that when Robb kissed his bride and the hall shouted, Grey Wind sat, ears pricked, as if waiting to learn whether this was to be dancing or knives. Roslyn sat to Robb's left. She said little at first. When she did speak, it was to ask about Winterfell, and her voice lit with a wonder that seemed at odds with the place they were sitting. I have never seen snow, she confessed. Not truly, only flurries like ash. Is it very quiet when it falls? It can be, Robb said, on nights when the wolves don't sing. I would like to hear them sing, she murmured, and when she lifted her gaze to Catelyn in search of the Queen's mother's approval, Catelyn found no malice, no craft. Only a girl who had been taught to be very careful and had learned too well. Bread and meat and little pastries dusted with sugar came and went. The fiddlers played a sprightly tune, and a Frey cousin in a green doublet sang of the trident and boys in boats. They danced. Robb's smile was unguarded once, twice, when the cup circled and the hall roared its pride at him. Catelyn could almost see the shape of another future rising up, pale and implausible as mist. Perhaps it could be so. Perhaps they had yanked themselves off the edge of some precipice and would now find purchase. The gods were not gentle, but they favored those who did not grovel. Later, when Roslyn had been conducted to the chamber set aside for them, Catelyn lingered in the hall with her goblet and the warm ache behind her eyes. Roose Bolton dipped his head to her as he passed as if to a stranger. His step was soft. There would be no noise to that man's treachery, whatever shape it took. Lame Lothar paused near her elbow to make a remark about the wine. Very sly, very servile. Lord Walder had withdrawn to a smaller table littered with chicken bones and sat with his sons. His face puckered in thought, delighted and sour at once. In the corridor outside Robb's door, both Grey Wind and a quiet young Frey stood guard. The direwolf's nose was high, tasting air. He looked at Catelyn and lowered his head, and she touched his skull as she had when he was a cub, when she had still been a lady of Winterfell and not a woman who understood the 1,000 ways a feast could become a slaughter. Keep him safe, she whispered, and went to find her own bed in the sprawl of passageways that smelled of old straw and river rot. Dawn came thin and blue. Robb broke his fast with porridge and black bread beside Roslyn, who sat straight-backed and folded, her hair unbound and falling like the breath of a candle along her neck. The Freys brought gifts: a brace of good crossbows, a casket of river pearls, a pair of hunting hawks. Lord Walder watched it all and smirked as if his hands were pressing hot coals under their feet. They did not linger. Robb had summoned his captains for a council, banners tucked round the long table like birds on a branch waiting for weather. The Riverlands campaign had turned to mire with Edmure's battle and the loss of Karstark's men to the wind. They would not regain the Westerlands while Tywin Lannister's gold tongue was free to whisper and his swords were braced by the reach. Harrenhal's black husk loomed over every map like a bad memory. The Ironborn held Moat Cailin like a knife stuck straight in the throat of the north. "We must take the neck back," Robb said. "We cannot climb walls of sea, and there is no road over the mountains in strength. Once Moat Cailin is ours, the north is ours. Once the north is ours, we can breathe." "Hard to take the moat," said Lord Blackwood with the absent gravity of a scholar reciting a text. "Hard to take, harder to hold." "Not if the Crannogmen open the gates for you," the great John rumbled. "They dance in the swamps like dragonflies and never show a man their feet." Robb touched the dagger lying across the map, its point marking the moat, that ancient pile of sinking stones. "I sent a raven to Howland Reed before we broke camp. There was an answer at dawn. They will meet us at Fever River and show us the paths no man writes on maps." "To call the reeds is to call ghosts," the Blackfish said. "I have seen a man follow a Crannog trail and wind up in water to his neck while the frog-eaters stand laughing on dry hummocks you'd swear were illusion." "Then let them conjure," Robb said, and a quick smile touched his mouth. "We will need their tricks." "Roose," Caitlin said softly, drawing eyes like fish to a lure, "we need Harrenhal held against Tywin's march, and no better man than you for a place that is all whispers and drafts." Roose Bolton bowed his pale head. "As my king wishes," he said. The words were smooth as water over eel-slick stones. "My men will keep the charnel castle, and we will watch the King's Road with care." Caitlin read what lay behind the words as she might read a palmed coin. She thought of her daughters. She thought of her sons. She thought of all the fine steel on the table and how easily a man's courage might skitter off polished plans and into some dark pocket of private ambition. She drew her cloak more closely around herself and said only, "See that you do." Gray wind slept beneath the table then and twitched as if in dreams of running through snow. They broke their camp at the Twins and flowed north by the Blue Fork. Roose turned east with a portion of the men and vanished among the reeds. Lord Walder stood on his battlements to watch the banners recede, a blot of darkness against the pale morning. His hand lifted in a farewell that looked like a spider twitching its legs. Rosalind rode near Caitlin, silent, riding side saddle on a gray mare with a pretty braided tail. The girl's cheeks were pink from cold. When Caitlin looked at her, she saw not a Frey but a young woman who had never expected to be queen and was discovering the new height of her life with every turn of the path. She took care with her words to the men who greeted her and to the girls in the supply train who came to see her veil. She thanked the servants. She learned the names of the ladies who had clung to Caitlin through the war, and when a wheel broke on a wagon of barley, she stood in the frozen mud beside the carter while the Blackfish organized men and ropes. That night, by a small fire tucked in a shallow fold of ground out of the wind, Rosalind asked Caitlin about Winterfell again. "You were born by the river," Rosalind said, "and now you will go back north with us. You will be cold." Caitlin laughed, surprised by the sound. "I will wear 2 cloaks. The gods send we find a roof to sleep beneath before the snow comes down by the armful." Rosalind smiled, and in that moment Caitlin felt the subtle loosening of a knot that had bound her since Robb had said he would wed at the Twins. The girl would do. No more, she would be kind. And kindness mattered, in bedchambers and in the cracks between plaques of duty. The march to the neck was a lesson in gray. The trees were bare of leaves, their branches black lace against a sky that had forgotten blue. They passed burned villages, places where the only note of color was the bright round eye of a kingfisher darting along a stream. They passed fields not yet turned for spring, not yet anything but stiff sod and patches of frost. The men ate, sang, sharpened their blades, mended their boots, gambled when the sergeants turned away, and in the morning stood in mist-breathing ranks while Robb rode along the lines and spoke to them. Caitlin heard him say the same thing a dozen ways to a dozen groups. "We go home by the gates of the world. We go north because we were born there. We take back what is ours because no one will give it." He did not bluster. He did not promise glory. He promised work and winter and wolves to sing them to sleep. The men cheered anyway, for his steadiness, and for the black shape that loped beside his horse. At the Fever River they met the Crannogmen. They came like the mist rises, through the rushes and across the water, small and gray-green, with leather corselets and frog spears, faces painted with thin lines that made them vanish when they were still. They drew their boats up in silence and stood in them as if the boats were part of the marsh itself. The man who stepped forward wore no marks of rank save a copper torque at his throat. He bowed no lower than was needful and looked at Robb as one would look at a tall tree in one's own wood. "I am Mira's uncle," he said in a voice like the edge of a reed. "My Lord Reed sends me." "And what does Lord Reed send?" Robb asked. "Paths," the man said, and smiled with white teeth. "And ghosts, if you like." They did not march so much as seep, led by crannig boats through channels invisible to a northerner's eye. Men picking their way by moss hummocks and roots that made an archipelago of firm, small islands in a sea of brown water. The marsh smelled of decay and green things and eels. Catelyn, riding, thought of Sansa's hair and Arya's stubborn mouth and wished, helplessly, that she could draw them to her with a reed whistle like a hunter calls birds. She thought of Bran and of Rickon. She thought of Theon Greyjoy's face at Winterfell and the unmarked graves beneath the bole of the hearth tree, and her heart grew heavy as a stone. The Ironborn in the moat did not see them until they were under the outer wall. Even then, the Ironborn laughed. "Come on, then." A voice rang down from a crenellation. "Come drown in our mire. Teach your boys to beg the eels for mercy." The reeds pulled their boats to the shadow of the ancient stones. The moat had sunk by inches and feet over the centuries into the moist earth that loved no man's wall. There were towers that now were only rings of damp stone. There were staircases that ascended to a level that was no longer air. The causeway from the south was guarded by Ironborn behind makeshift cart shields and bristles of spears. But nothing guarded the places a map would call impossible. The crannogmen showed the north how to become frog and ghost. On the second night, while rain stitched the surface of the marsh with silver threads, the first of Robb's men climbed the softened mortar with cords and stag sinew. Grey wind went before the first wave like a shadow that carried teeth. Catelyn, waiting in the boat with her heart full of cold water, heard a shout cut off in the dark, and then the soft thud of bodies dropped to the stones. She closed her eyes. Her fingers found the face of the old god's ring she wore and pressed the carved grooves into her skin until she felt almost calm. At dawn, the inner gatehouse opened to the sound of a horn blown once, briefly, as if the man holding the horn feared to wake a giant. The causeway defenders looked back and saw their rear turn to fog and javelins in silence. The crannogmen did not cry out. They took throats and slipped like slime. Robb's men surged over the causeway. The Ironborn made a hard knot at the second wall, hard men, with their salt stin. Kay and their sea gods and their willingness to die in any place as long as it was loud. Robb cut through that knot as if it had been tied for his sword. He moved like a boy who had trained in a yard and had learned to set aside the training when the world became blood. The Great John was a force of nature, roaring, hacking, laughing as if this were what his lungs were built to do. The Blackfish was precise, deadly, silent. When the Ironborn captain fell to a spear thrown from above, crannig hand and crannig aim, his men faltered, and that was enough. The gates opened, and the men of the north poured into their own inheritance. They found a dozen longships scummed up against the inner dock like black beetles, their sails furled, their hulls heavy with the damp of their captivity. The Ironborn who lived surrendered at last, drawn in by promises of their lives. The Ironborn who did not live decorated the pools with their blood, dark streaks on black water. When it was over, when the shouts had become orders and the orders simple things. Fire there, fetch water, bind his arm, count the bolts. Catelyn climbed at last to the highest sound tower and looked north. There, a thin line where the color changed, was the promise of the north. She did not weep. She simply stood with the wet wind combing her hair and thought of wolves. Robb came to her with grey wind at his heel and a crease of exhaustion carved between his brows. Rosalind walked at his side, her hands folded, her hem dark with marsh water. She lifted her face to the wind and smiled as though this were a chapel and they had come at last to the presence of something holy. "Is it very quiet when it snows?" she asked again. "Yes," Robb said. "When the world is muffled, you can hear your own blood. When you were very small, you would think the sky had fallen and it was all for you." Rosalind's smile softened. "Then I hope it falls for me." They did not tarry at the moat. Robb left a garrison and a reed, and the Crannog boats slid away with the silent competence of the swamp. The north opened its mouths and exhaled cold into their faces. The march north felt like a homecoming even in ruin. They found old men at the doors of cottages who could not say whether they'd seen the Greyjoys last week or last year. They found wolves in the outskirts of forests, a doe stepping through the snow with a hunter's arrow in her rump. At White Harbor, Lord Wyman Manderly embraced Robb with tears on his jowls and promised ships, gold, bread, and oaths as broad as the sea he coveted. He lingered too long on talk of justice and the wrong done to House Stark. Catelyn heard what he did not say. If the North is led, we will follow. If the North falters, we will do what fat men have always done and survive. Rickon, Wyman said later, in private, his breath green with onions and wine. There are rumors among the sailors of a beast of an island and a boy with a wolf. Rumors are ash, but ash can mark where a fire was. If there is a boy, and if that boy is one you have loved, shall we send men to find the truth of it? Catelyn gripped the arm of her chair. The rush rug beneath her feet felt like the deck of a ship suddenly. We sent men once to find my girls, she said. A man I trusted like a brother. He came back with none of them. Then let a man you do not trust go, Wyman said. Let him go to a place no man can own. It is a small cost, and we are fat enough to risk it. She knew what he was offering. A mission dressed as fealty and salted with secrecy. She looked at Robb and saw him weighing it too. If there is any hope of a brother, Robb said, we cannot turn away. Hope is treacherous, Wyman murmured, but it fills a belly when meat is scarce. They sailed a little, they marched more, and all along the way the rumors came to them like birds. King's Landing held fast under the lion's paw and the rose entwined with its claws. Stannis retreating like a bad dream to the volcanic keep that had birthed him. A prince in the south with a viper's grin. A woman with dragons across the sea raiding and ruling, and then who knew what? The wall groaning under a pressure of cold and dead. The wall. When the raven came with its rough-cut letters that stank of cold, Catelyn was sitting with Rosalind teaching her how to sew fur so that the seams did not show. The words had no grace in them. They were like stones. Catelyn felt them hit her and sink. Wildlings by the tens of thousands. Robb read aloud in a voice that was not for the hall but for the few who must hear. Giants. The dead waking. We hold Castle Black, barely. If the North has a king, let him be a king and send men. The hand was Jon's. When she closed her eyes, she saw him standing in the Winterfell yard, his face very still as he took his leave of them long ago. When she opened them, she saw the man that boy had become, carved in the strokes of his ink. We go, Robb said. We go now. The Dreadfort, the great Jon reminded him. Ramsay Snow sits in your seat and calls himself Lord of your halls, lighting fires with your father's memory. It will not sit well with the North if we pass his gate as if it were a fence post. Robb looked at the map as if it were a face with a familiar flaw. We cannot fight 3 wars. We will not let the wall fall. If it falls, there is no North to hold. Send me, said the Blackfish simply. Give me enough men to lift the Dreadfort's weight from the land and take back what is ours. You go to the wall. You are young enough to ride hard. The men will follow you better to the white causeway of the world than to a siege against a bastard. Ramsay will try to make a boast of blood, Catelyn warned, memory burning across her like a brand. He will do it slowly to make men afraid. My lord brother, do you have a stomach for slowness? The Blackfish's eyes were gray flint. My lady, I have more stomach for slowness than any Bolton. I have patience and I have rope. They deavy. Dead the strength of the North in a cold hall heavy with candle wax. Robb kissed Rosalind and told her to remain at White Harbor, where a merman's palace stood like a chest full of pearls and there was bread enough for a queen's household. Rosalind's hands were steady when she put them on Robb's cheeks. Her eyes were not. You will come back to me, she said, and it was not a question. I will come back to you, Robb said, and kissed her once, again, like a man placing his mouth to a spring before walking into a thirsty place. They rode hard on the King's Road, the old stones worn smooth, the miles unspooled beneath their horses' hooves with the dead leaves of winter whispering away. They saw no men but their own and the occasional watcher in a thicket who vanished like a fox before they could hail him. They saw crows, heavy and many, and the shadow of a big owl at dusk. The cold grew sharper, and their breath was like bright ribbons behind them. At Castle Black the gate opened with the slowness of old wood, and the stink of burned pitch blew out to meet them. The yard was a boneyard of broken scorpions and farm tools sharpened into pikes. Men with filthy faces passed buckets like monks pass wine at a fast breaking. Jon Snow stood on the steps into the main hall with a bandage around his shoulder and a look in his eyes that Catelyn had seen once before, when he had returned to the yard after being beaten badly by boys who thought him easy prey. He came down the steps with care, stiff in his movements, and bowed low. "Your Grace," he said to Robb. Catelyn's breath hitched. His face was older, and the scar along his cheek looked like a scratch from a lover's nail. She had made herself into stone where he was concerned because stone did not break as easily as flesh. Now, for a moment, the stone warmed. Robb dismounted without waiting for a squire, and Grey Wind bounded past him to the shadow of the ice wall, where he put his nose to the frozen surface and breathed like a great bellows. The dire wolf turned and trotted back to stand by Jon a moment, sniffed his bandage, and then went to Robb again. Jon's mouth quirked. "We had them at the wall," Jon said. His voice was hoarse. "Then not at the wall. Some climbed, some were carried up. There were giants, Robb. Real ones. The kind old Nan used to make brandy stronger to tell of. If not for the king who came out of the snows like a bad conscience, we would be bones ground into the ice." "Stannis," Robb said. "Then he is here." "In a fashion," Jon said, and his mouth did not know whether to smile. "He is at the end of his own rope of pride. He was too late for glory at the Blackwater, so he settled for the kind of victory only a few will sing about. He brought fire. It burned well. They met Stannis in the common hall, cleared of the worst of its wreckage. He stood like a man who had been carved to bear weight. His face was as spare as his banners, his hair receding as if his skull could not be troubled to hold on to it. Davos Seaworth stood behind him with the eyes of a dog who has learned the difference between a boot raised in affection and one raised for striking. "Your Grace," Stannis said to Robb. He did not say which of them the title rightly addressed. "You have come at last to the true wall, the wall that matters. Any idiot can hammer at another idiot with steel. Here the law of the living contends against the law of the dead. Are you ready to serve your realm, Stark, or only your pride?" Robb took the words as if they were small pebbles thrown by a child. "I am ready to throw my sword where it does the most good," he said. "Then bend the knee and let it be done." Silence held for a heartbeat. The men in the hall watched like wolves judge a stranger who steps into a ring of their firelight. Jon stood with his arms crossed and his face unreadable. Catelyn could hear wind moving through the wall like the breathing of a great sleeper. "The North will never accept a bent knee while its king still draws breath," Robb said. "But the North will not spite the wall to spite a man. My banners will fight beside yours against the others and their scarecrow armies. If you would command me, you must command all the North. But I will stand as king of my own." Stannis's mouth did not move. For a time Catelyn wondered if the man could bend joint or muscle at all to any shape but making or breaking. He looked at Robb as he might look at a piece on a Sivas board he had miscounted. "You will not," he said, "but you will. If I cannot make you swear, I will take your service and call it by wrong names until I die. You are young, and you confuse stubbornness for honor. All men do at your age. Very well. Fight beside me. When the wall holds, we will speak again. In the meantime," Davos put in softly, like a hand sliding a blade out of sight, "men must eat." "Men must eat," Stannis said, as if those were the saddest words he had ever understood. They ate, then, of porridge and onions and bits of pork cut from meat smoked beyond dignity. The men of the Night's Watch stole glances at Robb with a mingling of awe and distrust. They owed no fealty to kings. They owed fealty to the cold. That night Catelyn stood on the top of the wall, her cloak snapping, her cheeks burning. The world beyond was a black sea with icebergs of motion where the trees were. The stars looked nearer from here, as if a person might pluck one down and fold it in the pocket of a glove. She thought of Eddard beside her in the god's wood of Winterfell with the trees around him and the snow falling like feathers. She thought of Arya, somewhere in the world like a twig on a stream. If there was any mercy left in the order of things, let it not be spent on trifles. Let it be used where it mattered. The horns called them to arms again before dawn. Mance Rayder, king of those who had thrown away all kings, had not accepted the notion that one good hammer blow was enough. He had NT the night probing, testing, and now the giants came again, wrapped in skins, their hair like animal pelts, carrying logs like spears. The others were stories, men said. Their making and unmaking was gathered in the fog farther north. But there were dead men walking with the wildlings, men whose eyes were wrong, blue as the inside of a glacier. The fire burned them, and the smell was like burning fish. Robb fought on the yard with a long spear he'd taken from a rack, and beside him fought a brother he had once named Heir in paper silence. Jon moved with a smoothness born of doing what must be done while no one watched. His sword was a dark line in white air. Robb spared him one glance, and for that one glance Catelyn would have given the whole of the Frey's bridge to the flood. When the day was over, when Davos had put out the last of the fires and Stannis had looked down his nose at the dead scattered along the base of the wall with the tight mouth of a man counting the price of bread, Jon found Robb in a corner of the common hall. Without words they embraced, brief and very hard, and then stepped back as if they had crossed a border they both respected. "We cannot stay," Robb said. "I know," Jon said, "and yet I would keep you here if I could. There is something coming out of the north that makes kings and bastards the same. Cold meat for a knife." "Then we will send men," Robb said. "We will send men until sending men is like breathing. We will not let the cold knife us without reply." "There is a vow," Jon said, with a little tired humor breaking the crust of his voice. "You will need to keep your men out of trouble while they keep their oaths." "I will try not to tempt them," Robb said. He went south again with the knowledge of the real war like a shard of ice under his tongue. At White Harbor he found letters like traps. From the south. King Joffrey dead at his wedding, poisoned like a rat in a granary. From the south. Tyrion Lannister taken and condemned. From the south. Tywin dead, a crossbow quarrel finding him in his own private house. From the south. The Tyrells smiling with flowers in their hands, sharp stems hidden against their thumbs. From the west. Balon Greyjoy lost to the sea or wind. His brother Euron returned like a storm with black sails and wild men. From the east. Rumors of dragons like children's murders in distant towns. "Everything is changing," Rosalind said, turning a ring on her finger while Catelyn read. "We sit in this harbor, and the world swims past like fish." "It was always swimming," Catelyn said. "We were only too busy on the shore." Riverrun held. Harrenhal stood like a burned tooth in the mouth of the land. The Blackfish had made war on the Dreadfort with a surgeon's cold, cutting supply lines, capturing men who carried messages, planting tales of Bolton failure in ears that loved tales. Ramsay Snow had responded with fire and screaming banners in the night. The banners had not saved his men. When Robb's army came up the King's Road to the fork where it could turn to Winterfell or east to the Weeping Water, a rider in Tully colors found them with frost in his beard and news sharp as flint. The Dreadfort's outer walls had fallen, the inner holdfast was choked with smoke, and there was a flayed man strung on the gate whose face no one could recognize. "Ramsay?" Robb asked. The rider shook his head. "Too small, too smooth, could be a woman, could be a nothing. The Blackfish says the bastard lit his own hall to deny us the pleasure." "He will have fled to the hills," the great Jon said. "He skitters like a roach. We will find him." "Find him and do what?" Catelyn thought, not saying it. "When you kill a man like that, something of him remains. It goes into the light and waits, and sometimes it finds another face." She was tired of ghosts. They made Winterfell theirs again as a man makes a mound of rubble into a home. One beam at a time. The god's wood had survived the fire by miracle or stubbornness. The heart tree had new growth like delicate hands at the end of its scars. Men camped in the shell of the great hall and cooked in the open, and the sound of hammers became the measure of mourning. Snow began to fall on the 5th day, a thin veil that thickened until the world was muffled and the mouths of men blew steam like horses. Rosalind put out her hand and watched the flakes settle on her glove. Her face lit. "Hush," she said to no one, and the hush was true. A soft white quiet in which Catelyn could hear her own blood. Arya heard the hush from a different place, and it hurt her ears. She had not come to the twins in time to watch any hall save a door. The hound had brought her there, hard and bitter as hard bread, and she had been ready to bite the world in the throat if there was blood to buy her brother's life. Instead, she had found men coming out into the yard singing. She had seen banners fly in a gray, clean wind. The hound had stood a long time, his scarred face unreadable even to its owner. "Looks like your wolf remembers how to mend walls without bloodying them," he said at last. "Well, girl, you've got a choice. I can take you to them and sell you back for a purse of silver, or I can keep you, and we can go back to the road, and you can learn how to cut men low." She had spat. "Take me to my mother," she said, because she was not mad, and because she had been alone with wolves long enough to wish for a thin wrist to hold even if her teeth wanted meat. They had walked into the twins like beggars. The hound had gone to the guard captain with his head down and his helm under his arm and had spoken plainly. The guard captain had looked to someone behind a screen that had not been there a moment before, and then someone had run, and Arya had felt the world tilt on its side. When Catelyn came into the anteroom, the air squeezed out of Arya's chest like breath pressed from a bellows. She had thought she was too hard to cry now. She was wrong. She clung, and for a long time the only word either of them had was the old name that is not a name but a place. There. The hound stood in a corner and looked as if he would vomit. "What do you want?" Catelyn asked him when she had breath for words that were not all blood. He shrugged a shoulder. "Coin." "How much?" "As much as you would have paid to buy your daughter from a different sort of man." Catelyn named a number. He named another. They split the difference, and the hound walked out of the castle with his purse heavy and his hand on his sword hilt. When Arya tried to follow him with her eyes until he vanished, Catelyn's hand closed on her shoulder. "Do not make a hero of a man who only did what was easy," Catelyn said, and Arya laughed without humor. "Then who is a hero?" she asked. "No one," Catelyn said. "Everyone. It depends on the door you stand behind." Arya went north by river. She did not like boats, but she liked horses less, and the world was now too full of men who would know a girl with short hair and sharp teeth. She slept sitting up in a coil of rope and dreamed of the funny wood face in the god's wood at Winterfell looking down at her with a mouth that had trees for lips. When she woke, she had a splinter in her palm and a sense that the world had blinked. Winterfell's gray walls rose like something that remembered itself slowly, a story told in steel and ash. Arya stepped down onto its hard ground and smelled home. It smelled like smoke and wolves and the old stone that has sweat in it. She stalked through the snow as if she lived there still and found the training yard where she had once danced with a wooden sword. Robb turned at the sound of her boots. The old part of him went bright in his face, and for a moment he was a boy and she was a girl, and the word she said was that same old name. There. He hugged her and picked her up and spun her once and put her down carefully because he was a king now and his back hurt in a new way. She wanted to punch him. She did not. She punched his arm, lightly. It made a sound like a bird tapping a window. Catelyn watched them a long time. Rosalind stood beside her with her hands folded, and that careful look the very young carry in their eyes when they find themselves in a painting. "Your daughter," Rosalind said softly, as if naming a star. "She looks like you." "She looks like herself," Catelyn said, and shook her head because her mouth wanted to run away with praise and apologies, and neither would be useful now. "I am taking her to the God's Wood. There is a thing I must do with my children." She took Arya by the fingers, and together they went through snow into the place where the heart tree stood. It had grown new shoots. It looked wounded and determined. Catelyn fell to her knees and pressed her hands to the cold, living wood, and closed her eyes. "I will make bargains," she thought, "that I have no right to make. I will ask things that have no right to be asked. I will give what I have left if there is a coin that counts with the old gods. The hush of falling snow was an answer of a kind. When she rose, she wiped her face with the back of her glove and became a queen's mother again. There was no place for softness now. Not while ravens flew from the south with tales of Cersei's reign of thorns and Marjorie's smile like a blade wrapped in silk. Tyrion Lannister had vanished from his city and was rumored to be on the stepstones with a Sel's word and a bad temper. Tywin's bones were in the ground, but his shadow still reached everywhere men pretended to be significant. In the Riverlands, Black Walder bided his time like a rat you cannot trap because it has learned the shape of your traps. In the Dreadfort's ashes, a bastard with a taste for screams learned what it is to flee. The storm that mattered, though, was the cold one. Robb sent men north to the wall by companies, not in a flood because a flood drowns and a river nourishes. He sent the Mormonts and their women with their fierce, tight-lipped faces. He sent men from Deepwood Motte who had known the press of the Ironborn and were not gentle from it. He sent recruits who were too young to have learned how to die properly and too wild to be kept in Winterfell without breaking furniture. He went himself again to the wall for a parley with Stannis that was half chess game, half sermon. On the third of those journeys, when the cold was a knife and the wind a hand on your face, they met halfway at a watchtower that had lost half its face to a storm. Stannis came with fewer men than last time, and he looked thinner, as if he were being carved down to his true self. He did not ask for oaths. He did not offer them. "There is a village on the East Road," Stannis said without preamble, as if they were two farmers discussing a fence that plagued them both. "It has not had heat in a month. The dead come at night and take a man, a woman, a child. The villagers fight with axes. When the sun rises, the dead walk away with their prizes. The snow is pitted with the holes their feet make. Do you know what it is to see a child taken by night and nothing in the morning to mark it but holes like fish kisses? I should like to have had sons who did not die of fever, Stark. Instead I have a child who burns men in her God's name and who looks at me as if I were a thing to be weighed." He lifted his eyes. The wind flattened his hair. "We will do ugly things, and there will be no singing about them. Will your ladies stomach it?" "My ladies," Robb said, "have been feeding men who do ugly things for 2 years. They will stomach it. They will also roast you if you demand too much salt." Davos coughed something like a laugh and then looked embarrassed, as if he had sneezed in a September. The talk went on, the exchange of men and bread and places. It was not grand. It did not feel like the stuff of legend. Felt like work. Spring did not come. An owl nested in the hole in Winterf, LL's library tower where once a window had been, and men said that was luck, and Catelyn smiled when she heard it because she wanted a reason to smile, even if it came with droppings. Bran and Rickon were still either ghosts or boys hiding among wolves, and hope was a blade that would cut you. But sometimes she looked at Arya and saw a future that was sharper than her fear. Sometimes she found Rosalind standing alone in the snow, holding her shawl tight around her shoulders, looking at the sky, and she saw in that sight the peculiar courage of a girl who had slept in a castle built over a river and now was learning how the world felt when it froze. In King's Landing, Cersei Lannister flowered into paranoia as a vine flowers into thorns. She lashed the Tyrells with old words and new schemes. A man from Dorne danced with steel in an arena masked as a court and died like a song you cannot hear the end of. His death burned in the city for weeks. Sansa Stark, who was called Elaine in the Vale, grew out of girlhood into something tall and composed, taught by a man whose compassion was like a glove stuffed with stones. She learned to smile. She learned to lie. She learned to listen to the wind on the mountain and to bake a simple pie for a septon and then to watch a child stand, with perfect stillness, and speak in a voice that made men shake. Across the sea, a girl with titles shook a city by its throat and found that men did not like to be unchained when there was nothing to tie them to. She learned the burden of rule in a place that was not hers. She learned that freeing is not the same as keeping. She learned to sit a dragon as carefully as a lady sits a new chair. The world whispered about her. The world always whispers about girls. Catelyn tucked that whisper away with all the others. And always the stories from the north. Blue-eyed men who did not breathe, the sound of ice cracking where no river ran, a bear made of dead meat that lumbered into a camp and had to be burned with men's hands because the fire had been soaked by snow. The old gods stood where they always had, and their faces in the trees did not change. But Catelyn sometimes felt that if she looked away and then back quickly, they would be wearing expressions that had not been there before. In the spring that never came, the Freys tried once, in a smaller hall than the twins, to draw steel with music. Lame Lothar planned it in a place with low beams and painted birds on the rafters. It would have been clever if not for the boy they had not counted on. A squire from White Harbor with a scarf his lady had knit wrapped around his neck and a poor habit of listening at doors. He had a way of remembering words better than faces. He heard the word for crossbow whispered 3 times in places where only song should have been. He had the sense to tell a drunk guard who had the sense to tell a man who might actually be awake. The hall was searched. The crossbows were found wrapped in linen under casks of wine. The men who had placed them there vanished into the countryside with a speed that suggested planned vanishing. "I should have killed them all," Walder Frey complained later, when he wrote to explain how he could not be held responsible for the actions of his couldn't say which kin. "Who can keep track of sons in such numbers? Surely not a busy man like me." "We will keep track for you," Robb wrote back, and the men at White Harbor laughed when they copied the letter for Catelyn to read. It was not laughter of joy. It was the laughter that keeps a man from howling. By the time the trees wore a faint lace of green that seemed more promise than leaf, Winterfell's great hall had a roof again. It was not the old roof. It was made by new hands that had never known boyhoods under it. Kept the snow out. On the night they lit the hearths and ate honeyed turnips and beef from a farmer who had given up his prize ox with tears and been paid in coin and grain. Catelyn walked the repaired galleries and listened to the sound of men trying to remember how to live. Arya sparred in the corner with a Mormont girl who might one day lead 6 men into death without fear. Rosalind sat with a lute in her lap, plucking a tune with care, her mouth open in a soft O of concentration. Robb stood with the Blackfish, speaking quietly. They looked out at the men who would be asked to do impossible things. Robb's face was quiet and attentive. He had a look to him now, a man who would never be safe again but who did not expect safety. A man who understood that the things you want most are often the ones the world does not value. Catelyn stood beside the heart tree the next morning and spoke to her gods. "I do not ask for victory," she said at last, after she had emptied herself of smaller wishes. "Snow without starvation. Bread enough for the men of the watch, Arya's fingers whole after sparring. I ask for sense. Give my son sense enough to refuse the easy thing and the prideful thing. Give him sense enough to keep something for himself when the world tears at him. Give me sense enough to know when to step away." The wind sighed through the red leaves and did not answer, but the hush that followed felt like an assent. She laid her hand against the white bark and let her breath slow. Beyond the wall of trees, wolves called, not in fear, not in hunger, but in that wild, sorrowful joy that says we are here and we are listening for you. Months later, when men would tell the story of how the North had held the wall and then held the lands below it against the first real push of the dead, they would start with other names and other nights. For Catelyn, it began in Winterfell's yard with snow powdering the shoulders of the men and Robb holding a parchment with Stannis's crabbed hand across it. "There will be a war in the night," he read. "Bring fire." They packed pitch and oil and fear. They moved north like a dark river. They stacked the dead where they fell. ND burned them even when it took the last of their faith that anything burned could be safe. They watched men fall and rise again and become the enemy. They watched giants die and felt no triumph in it. They watched Jon Snow move along the parapet and call orders and see more than men twice his years. They saw Stannis stand like a post in a storm and not snap. They saw Davos give a loaf to a boy who had killed a thing with his mother's face. When the night was over and remained a night, no dawn breaking, only a thinning of the dark, they said we held. They did not say we won. They said we held and we learned, and the learning was a thing like a child's growth. It happened suddenly and slowly in the same moment. In Winterfell, later, when the first true spring came with the sound of water pouring off roofs and the smell of damp earth, Catelyn sat with Rosalind in the garden between the rookery and the kitchens. Rosalind had a rounded stomach under her gown. Her hands rested on it like a woman cupping a lamp. She hummed a little, distracted and hopeful. Arya came past with a spear on her shoulder and glanced at the swelling with an expression that was difficult to decipher. Fear, envy, curiosity, all of them as fleeting as swallows. "Does it hurt?" Arya asked, stopping. "Not as such," Rosalind said. "It is heavy. It makes it hard to climb stairs." "I can carry you," Arya offered, very serious. Rosalind laughed, startled, and then put a hand to her back and sighed. "It is kind of you. You are brave," Arya said, and turned away as if embarrassed by the notion that she had said a kind thing aloud. "Braver than I thought you were, when we were at the twins." "I was terribly frightened at the twins," Rosalind admitted. "I still am, most days. I think bravery is not a thing you are, but a thing you do when you cannot find a way to run." Arya considered this and nodded as if memorizing a lesson from a master-at-arms. "Sometimes running is right," she said, "but sometimes it is only a way of making the world catch you badly." Catelyn listened, her heart turning over for all she had lost and for all she had somehow kept. She thought of old Lord Walder counting his sons like coins. She thought of Roose Bolton moving through rooms without sound. She thought of Ramsay somewhere, a shadow with knives, and of the Blackfish who had gone hunting him, lean and inexorable, a river's current under a crust of ice. She thought of Jon Snow at the wall and the girl across the sea with dragons and the woman in King's Landing whose love was a sickness that had become a state. She thought of Eddard, a man whose honor had been made into a rope. She thought of a little boy with a wooden sword who had taught her that even play was serious in a cold world. She did not think, not even once, of Guest Right broken in song. That melody had been changed. A different tune carried them now, and it was not pretty, and it did not end. But it held. On a night when the snow had melted into a steady drip from eaves and the frogs in the distant marshes sang as if the world had thought enough to be worth living in, Robb stood on Winterfell's repaired wall and watched the moon climb. The stones beneath his hands were not the same stones on which his father had stood, but they felt like kin to them. He heard footsteps and did not turn. He knew the sound of her walk. "Tell me a story," Rosalind said, coming to him with a cloak over her nightdress. He wrapped it more tightly around her. In the courtyard, a guard coughed. Somewhere a dog barked, and perhaps it was not a dog. "What kind?" he asked. "Tell me the story where you broke a thing and then made it whole again," she said simply. "I do not care for dragons tonight. I care for mending." He thought of the twins and the bread and the way his mother had watched the corners of every room. He thought of Rosalind walking into a hall with garlands of thyme and not knowing whether those would be spice or funeral. He thought of the moat and the ladder of old stone. He thought of Jon's hand on his shoulder, the weight of a brother's wordless kinship. He thought of the heart tree in the snow and of Arya's fierce grin and of the look on his mother's face when she had seen her children alive at the same table. "I broke my word," he said at last. "And then I learned that there is no making whole what you break, only making new. Winterfell is not what it was. We are not what we were. But we are ourselves, and that is sometimes enough." Rosalind laid her head against his shoulder. In the Godswood, a flake of early spring snow, mad and lost, fluttered down onto the waiting leaves and melted there. The wolves sang, far off, as if remembering something they had been told long ago and had only now found the words for. In that thin, bright interval where the world was neither winter nor spring but both, the north held its breath, and then let it out again. The breath steamed and vanished, and the next came, and the next. Men mended harness, women patched shirts, children learned new games with old stones. The letters from the south continued like gulls, screaming and petty and impossible to quiet. Across the sea, clouds moved like armies. Beyond the wall, the dead counted themselves and sharpened their silence. Catelyn slept that night with a hand on the rail of her bed, as if she might steady the world if it veered. She dreamed, not of Eddard, not of girls lost and found, but of a narrow slice of river under a bridge where minnows turned, glittering all at once. When she woke, she went to the window and looked down into the yard. Robb was there already, speaking to the men who would go out on patrol, his hair damp with mist, his cloak open. He looked up and saw her and lifted his hand. A small motion, like a son childishly showing his mother that he still wore the glove she had knit. She lifted her hand in turn and felt the day gather itself around them. A common day by ordinary measures, extraordinary by theirs because it still existed, because they all still breathed. Somewhere below, Rosalind laughed, and the sound went through the air like a thread stitching wool. They had not avoided all the ruin the world had to give them. They had raised a different kind. They had laid new beams on old stones and learned the trick of standing between fires. They had found the kind of courage that looks like work and sounds like the creak of leather. In the distance, beyond the pines, the voice of a horn drifted to them, a single clear call drawn through cold air. It was a call to arms and a reminder, both. Men buckled belts. Women sent them with bread. Arya came to the threshold of the great hall with a wolf at her side who had chosen her not because she was gentle but because she moved through the world as if she were listening for the same things wolves do. She looked out across the yard and saw the snow's last tatters on the shadows and where the sun had eaten it away. She saw her brother below and her mother above and the long shallow arc of a day opening like a bow. She smiled the small crooked smile of someone who has counted the edges of a thing and decided it is worth holding even though it cuts. Then she went out and the door swung to behind her, and the sound it made was not like a closing. It was like a breath drawn. Ready? Snow fell in long, slow flakes that did not so much drop as decide to be elsewhere. Arya stood with her back to the ruined wall where the old archery butts had been and watched the way the white blurred the edge of the godswood. She had a wooden spear across her shoulders. Her bare hands were raw and red from the day's drills, and she liked the sting. It was a clean hurt, a good reminder that she was still made of blood and bone and not the smoke of old days. A rangy gray she-wolf skulked along the yard's far side, tail high, not skulking at all if you knew wolves, just moving the way they do, like shadows with muscles. Arya had not named her. Names were for the ones that slept before a hearth and wagged for scraps. The she-wolf had found Arya outside Winter Town when a butcher's boy had tried to lay a hand on her purse. The wolf had ghosted out from a hedgerow and put her muzzle between Arya and the boy had seen old stories come awake and run. They'd kept each other since. It wasn't love. It was something that made love look simple and small. "You'll ruin your hands," Lyra Mormont called from the yard center. Lyra was 15 and moved as if every muscle in her body had been turned out and polished for company. "Can't hold a needle with ragged skin." "I hold my needle fine," Arya said. "Better than fine." She flipped the spear off her shoulders and came to stance, feeling her feet find the stone's joins by habit. Again, Lyra shook her head, half a scold, half an invitation. They circled. In the gallery above, a pair of stable boys leaned to watch and then pretended they weren't, bundling their cloaks tighter when the wind turned its face toward them. The snow made the yard quiet. The little sounds were loud. The scrape of boot sole, the intake of breath, the soft chuff when the she-wolf's paws landed. They moved fast. Arya liked fast. She liked the way her mind emptied when the world narrowed to angles and openings. Lyra pressed hard at the start and then softened, drawing Arya out, letting her overreach and paying for it with a tap to the ribs. Arya grinned with her teeth and paid the tap back with a blunt slap to Lyra's thigh that would flower blue beneath leather. When they broke, both were breathing hard and both were grinning. "That'll do," said the Blackfish's voice from the shadow of a post. It always surprised Arya that men as large as he could become so much part of the looking that you didn't see them until they wanted seeing. He came forward, scarf loose around his neck, cheeks windbroken and bearded like an old fox. "You fight to learn, not to win. Keep that, and the winning will come by itself." Lyra wiped her mouth with the back of her glove. "Did you learn that from Riverrun's drill masters, Sir? Or from the men who tried to teach you manners?" Brynden Tully's laugh was a dry rasp that somehow held warmth. "From a fishwife on the Red Fork who cracked me with a pole when I climbed her fence for quince 6 decades ago. She told me to reach less and eat more. I have tried to heed her." "What does she say about hunting bastards?" Arya asked before she could tuck the words back down where they usually lived. "The other kind." The Blackfish's eyes sharpened and then softened. "Stubborn beasts," he said. "You cannot chase them in a straight line. They run ragged and make you waste your breath. You set lines for them, and you make them go where you want by making the places they want feel like dead ends." He would know. The Dreadfort's black soot still lined the seams of his cloak. It seemed the soot had settled into his beard, too, an old fire that clung. He had come back leaner and without boasting. There were men who wore victory like a new cloak, strutting and waiting for you to admire the cut. The Blackfish wore it like an old belt, solid and unadorned, useful because it had held when it had to. At night, by the new great hall fire, he spoke little of the stormy push at the gates, the smothering smoke, Ramsay Snow slipping like an eel into cold water while his dead haul fell around the men too slow to follow. He said less still of the boy they'd found in the kennels, all bone and rattled breath and eyes like a dog that has been taught to bite itself when it wants to bark. Now he lifted a hand in the direction of the keep. "Your mother will want you cleaned and within walls before the light goes," he said. "There's a supper with the men from Last Hearth who've brought news, and I'd rather you listen than hear it after with someone's talk cut shorter." "What news?" Lyra asked, at once eager and prepared to be disappointed. "The sort that makes men bring tales with their hats in their hands," he said. "Go on, and feed your friend. She's learning to love our kitchen scraps too well to hunt." Arya clicked her tongue and the wolf came, deliberate, as if to say she came for her own reasons and no one else's. Together they crossed the yard. The snow thickened, and the yard softened, and for a moment it felt like the world could be pressed into a quiet place and kept there with a blanket laid gentle. Catelyn had a bunch of dried lavender in one hand and a pin in the other when Arya shouldered through the door to the small solar the women had claimed, and she did not turn at once. She was all fingers and consideration, making a sachet for the chest where Rosalind kept her linen. It was such a small thing to do in a world that had become built out of large, hard things, and that was the point of it. Arya watched her mother's hands and remembered a time when those hands had been everything that made the world feel shaped and safe. "You will drip on the floor, little wolf," Catelyn said, and only then turned, smiling, not the smile she had for the hall or for the men, but the one she had when a milk pan had set sweet, and there was enough for everyone. "I will wipe it up," Arya said. "Lyra will help. She owes me a slash to the leg." Catelyn's mouth lifted at one corner. "Does she?" "Yes." Arya could not help her own half-grin. "We'll argue it thoroughly. Did the men from Last Hearth bring news like the Blackfish says?" "They did." Catelyn tied off the sachet and laid it in the chest, taking a moment to breathe the sharp, beaten smell of the lavender. "The dead have been seen near the Long Lake." A boy with a hair in his hand ran across the ice to say it before his head was ready. "Poor thing." He said the dead moved like men who had lost their shadows. When they stopped, the wind stopped too. Arya's throat went tight. The wolf leaned against her knee as if something had plucked an invisible string between them both. "How far?" she asked. "Far enough to give us time," Catelyn said. "Near enough to make us spend it wisely. There will be a patrol out of Winterfell at first light, and a second out of Last Hearth in 2 days to meet them. Your brother will not send you with the first." "He should," Arya said before she could tamp it down. Catelyn only looked at her, a gaze that held both a mother's blade and a mother's bomb. Arya stared back and then looked away, down at the wolf's shoulder, at the stiff bristle of her fur, at the piece of straw caught there. "I will have him send you with the second," Catelyn said after a heartbeat. The words were iron. It would be done. With Lyra. With a dozen who think they can be invisible in snow because they have not yet tried it. "You will be my eyes that go to places my feet cannot. You will come back." "I will," Arya said, which was the easiest lie she had ever told, and strangely it felt like the truest promise. That night, the men of Last Hearth ate with their mittens looped around their belts like talismans. They retold the boy's story with more order and less breath. The tale was the same for all their straightening. Men found with their mouths open and no breath, a cow lowing until she sank and was a shape under snow, a thin ring of ice that held prints the way a palm holds lines. They were umber men, loud and not inclined to let fear sit on their shoulders without hurling it down and stomping it with jokes. They told 2 good jokes and 1 filthy one, and then they fell quiet and looked toward the fire as if something were there they wanted to see. Robb listened without flinching and with a merciless attention that made men stand straighter. Grey Wind lay behind his chair with his nose on his paws and made no sound except when the doors opened and the cold stroked in. When the last of the stories had been laid down, Robb raised his hand. "We will answer," he said, "and the wall will be told, and the men there will be ready for what they already are ready for. We will learn the land by winter's measure and not summer's. We will not be brave and foolish. We will be brave enough." The great John grunted approval. Wyman Manderley, who had come up from White Harbor with a belly that seemed to have its own climate and a merry eye that missed little, nodded and then closed his mouth around a sausage like a man sealing a vow. Rosalind sat at Robb's left, her hands folded, her face pale with a glow the fire favored. She met Catelyn's gaze across the rushes and offered a small, brave smile that looked, to Catelyn, like the first fragile leaf that dares the frost. That night, in the long quiet after, Catelyn dreamed of trees walking. She woke with the taste of cold iron in her mouth and went to the window and blessed the simple shape of the yard. The well, the steps, the stables. There were some things in the world you needed to be ordinary, solid, and there when you reached without thinking. She touched the sill and thanked the man who had planed it smooth. At the wall, the wind made pulp of a voice if you raised it too high. Jon Snow had learned to pitch his words low and let the air carry them along. He stood on the steps of the shield hall with a cracked plank pulpit in front of him and men stacked in benches. More than 100, fewer than there should be. They were old, some. They were young, too many. They were hard and gaunt and not given to clapping for speeches. "We have work," Jon said simply, and had to wait for the second cheer to die. It was a derisive cheer. Cotter Pike had scoffed first out of habit, and men liked to show off for Cotter. Jon held up a hand, palm out, and the room quieted as if the hand took sound and put it in a pocket. "Work," he said again. "That will have no song and very little glory. We need a man to take Eastwatch and a man to hold the Shadow Tower. We need a man who can speak to wildlings and a man who can listen to them. We need to be too many things, and we are not enough of any of them. So we will be the one thing we are required to be, the one we swore to be, the Watch." Dennis Mallister's beard made a soft scraping sound when he turned his head. Othel Yarwick coughed into his fist. Samwell Tarly sat toward the back, Gilly near him, Babe asleep against her breast in layers of dead men's wool. Maester Eamon, thin as the shadow of a reed, slept in a chair that tried to be a throne just by sitting under that window and catching the gray light. The voting went the way rivers go around stones. Stannis had stood back, which meant he had moved pieces without putting his hands on them. Davos had frowned when he saw it and did not like the shadow of his own king falling into places where oaths had their own gravity. Still, the counting stones passed, and the songs of men who thought they were clever were sung half under breath, and Jon found himself standing with them pressed into his palm and the realm on his shoulder. Later, Stannis looked at him like a carpenter measuring a beam for a dangerous span. "You could have been a lord," he said without heat. "The way a man says a plank could have been wider if the tree had been bigger. You could have been Stark. I offered it. You offered me Winterfell when it was not yours to give," Jon said. "It is not mine to take, and my brother has a life." "He has a wife," Stannis said, and the words had edges. Everything Stannis said had an edge if you held it long. "He has a war that will eat him if he does not eat it first." "I have a wall," Jon said. "I have work." Stannis snorted a gust of cold and, after a breath, nodded, not in approval but in acknowledgement of a fact he could not alter. "You do," he said. "So do I. The last time I did work like this there was a river of green fire. Now it is the wrong color for songs and the wrong smell for priests." He tightened his cloak. "If I die on this wall with you, boy, it will be an honest death. I cannot say that of many places. Honesty is a kind of warmth," Davos observed later, half in jest and mostly not. "It keeps you alive long enough to be miserable." He did not stay long enough to be miserable. He had errands to run on a king's rough ledger. He sailed south with a convoy that looked like a line of punctuation marks on the gray sea and beached a single skiff in White Harbor with the unassuming air of a man who knows how to look like a fisherman when he needs to. Lord Wyman Manderley received him in a chamber that smelled of pork and old secrets. There were tapestries on the walls that showed whales with mouths like laughter and mermen holding painted harps. Bread and salt were offered, taken, and Davos ate the bread with a fisherman's quick appetite and let the salt sit on his tongue until he could taste the sea. Wyman watched him as if counting pieces on a board. "You come as His Grace's man," Wyman said. "You come with a claim like a hat on your head." "I come with work," Davos replied, not entirely comfortable with the familiarity he had learned at the wall. "His Grace would have the North swords for the fight men will never sing about because it is too cold for singing." "The North remembers," Wyman said, and the laugh that rumbled in his gut made the tapers flutter. "It remembers being asked for its blood. It remembers who emptied its veins. It remembers, too, when the men of the South did not listen when we told them the wind could kill a man quicker than a sword." "I carry more than one message," Davos said quietly. "The king would have your ships. He offers what he always offers. Oaths and iron. That is his cask." "And in your pocket?" Wyman asked, eyes bright, voice lowering. "What small thing do you carry like a smuggler carries a note in a glove?" Davos looked at his fingers. He had no bones in that pouch now. He carried memory instead. "There are rumors," he said. "The air in the wall speaks of a boy, small no longer, with a wolf big as a pony. There are men who say Skagos breeds wild things and eats their own and can be no place for a lord's son. There are men who say there is no boy. There are men who say all sorts of things. Men say—" Wyman echoed, amused and intent. He spread his hands on the table. They were not small hands for a man so large. "Bring him to me," he said. "Bring Rickon Stark to me, Ser Davos Seaworth, and I will give you bread you cannot carry and ships that will make other men's harbors tremble. Bring me the boy, and I will make songs come true by main strength and meat. Bring me the boy, and I will remember." "What if I do not come back?" Davos asked. "We will remember that too," Wyman said. "I will sing a song that hurts your king's ears. Go. I will give you a ship that looks like three. If it breaks, it will break with style and drown you in a comfort any Manderley would envy." He sent Davos with a crew of hard men who had the look of swords left too long in the scabbard and drew him into a side passage afterward with a small man whose eyes were blue with truth and deceit both. "You will not be alone," Wyman murmured, and put into Davos's hand a carved charm of a whale that felt oddly warm. "This is a piece of wood. It will do nothing. Still carry it. It will remind you that men tell stories for a reason, and the reason is sometimes the only thing that keeps a man from going mad when the world is large and humorless." Skagos rose out of a fog like something a tired god had thrown down in anger. The cliffs were raw, the sea a bad-tempered beast that threw itself against stone and gnawed. The men of the island wore wool and furs and faces that did not change when you smiled at them. They carried axes as if they were spoons. Davos learned their few words for peace and their many words for "do that again and I cut you." He learned that the unicorns were beasts with single horns and bad manners, and that if you stood very still when they came, they might only gore you lightly. He learned where the small paths were between rocks that looked like the backs of drowned giants. He learned, one dusk that stained the world, that a boy with hair in his eyes and a wolf with a face like a nightmare watched him from a ridge. He did not go to them, he did not reach. He sat and made a small fire and put his hands to the warmth as if he were only a tired sailor under a sky that had run out of patience. He said a name like a prayer and like a curse. Rickon. Then he said another name that surprised him by tasting of hope. Osha. They came of their own. The wolf came first, black as the middle of a moonless thought. The boy followed, moving like something that had learned to be led by nothing but hunger and the moon. He did not speak at first. He sniffed, like any animal. When he did speak, he told Davos he was too old to be fetched and too wild to be tamed and too far to be taken back. Osha watched with a spear in her hand and a question in her eyes that no man had answered for her yet. What good ever comes with boats? None, Davos admitted, which made her snort, and that was a start. But sometimes they take men to places they need to be. What place is that? She asked. The one where your boy's name is not something said in whispers, Davos said. The one where his sister can teach him to hold a spear right so he does not break his wrist. The one where the snow falls and there is meat on the spit and the men who look at him see his father's jaw and hear his mother's tongue. The one with a tree that bleeds when the world is careless with knives. Rickon's eyes went very bright. Shaggy says kill, he said, simple as a child says cup when what he means is I am hungry. Shaggy is wise, Davos said. But sometimes even the wise go where there is fire and leave the ice to the dead. Osha spat into the fire, a long thread of spit that hissed like a small snake. If we go, she said, and you drown us with your cleverness and your names, I will come up from the bottom and drag you down to show you what the dead say in their houses. If we go and your lord does not keep the bread fair, I will take his hand and eat it before I beg. I do not doubt it, Davos said, and held out his empty hands the way a man holds them out to a god he does not quite believe in. Back in Winterfell, gray daylight leaned against the glass and would not pry itself away. Rosalind moved carefully through the corridors as if the air were glass, too, and might shatter. She had a hand on her belly more often than not now, not protectively exactly, reverently perhaps like a septa touching a relic. Midwives came and went, solid women with hands that knew how to measure time by touch. They looked at Catelyn with professional incuriosity. A woman of her years had no use for their art now, but a mother might still be a kind of apprentice. When the pains came, Rosalind did not cry out. She breathed with discipline that would have made a swordsman proud. Robb held her hand for a time and then left when the midwife's look turned from friendly to making a suggestion a king should know how to hear. Catelyn sat at the hearth with Arya on one side and Winifred Manderly on the other, and they spoke of nothing. They spoke of the pie Winifred had made last harvest that had not set. Too much marrow, too little flour. They spoke of how snow tasted when you ate it from the stone at the heart tree's roots. They spoke of nothing until the cry came, sharp and tear-salt sweet. Robb went to the bed like a man going to a judgment and came away like a man absolved. In his arms, red-faced and furious at the cold, was a daughter. The midwife wiped the child with a linen cloth and scowled at Robb until he surrendered the tiny life grudgingly, so she could count fingers and pull a breath into a chest new to air. Rosalind watched with her hair plastered to her temples and her eyes vast. "What name?" the midwife asked Catelyn, because some old custom decreed it thus here, when the father had no sister older than the mother and the mother was too tired to trust her own voice. Winterfell had a long list of small, stubborn rules like that. They were nails in the world's boards. Catelyn looked at Rosalind, who looked at Robb, who looked at the fire, and the answer came to his tongue as if it had been waiting there for months. "Lyanna," he said. It rode out on his breath like something heavier. "Lyanna Stark." Catelyn felt the name like a cold hand and a warm. She did not love ghosts. She had had enough of them. But this was not a ghost. Not a woman dying in a bed of blood while a boy with a crown nowhere in sight promised things he could not give. This was a child turning the air with her lungs for the first time, making the world answer. "Lyanna," Catelyn said, and the name did not cut her as she had feared. It mended, a little, where she had not known she was torn. They christened the baby in the weirwood site, and in the sept they had made in a small room with a seven-sided lantern, and the gods managed to share her without bickering in the rafters. When they came back to the hall, Wyman Manderly stood and toasted the baby's name with tears on his cheeks and grease on his chin. When he sat, he shifted on his bench with a grunt and beckoned to a pair of lean Freys with anxious eyes. Cousins, third something, of a branch you could not keep on paper. He clapped each on the shoulder as if he loved them. They laughed, too loudly. They were very grateful for the attention of a great lord. They did not come back after they left with him. Catelyn did not ask. She knew what the North remembered and how men who had not been taught properly will keep teaching until their lesson draws blood. She went out into the yard while the hall grew louder and stood with her face tipped up into the weather. The snow had stopped. The sky wore all its stars. She said a prayer that was not quite to the old gods and not ite to the seven, but to the small decency of bread and salt and the crossways where men meet. Let us not make a habit of murder, she asked the cold. Let us not teach our children to make pies of men and call that cleverness. Let us not turn our victories into feasts we regret. The cold did not answer. It rarely did. News came out of the vale wrapped in mountain air. A letter, plain, well-made but not showy, arrived by a man whose boots had been cut for climbing and broke his feet on flat land. Lady Lisa Arryn was dead, and Lord Peter Baelish stood very straight and very helpful over the affairs of a boy who coughed and slept and looked at the world with the suspicious wonder of one who has learned not to trust toys. Elaine Stone, Baelish's bastard ward, had sung in the mountain hall while storm piled against the Ares' shoulders. Men talked about a voice that put thoughts in order, that took fear and stood it in a corner. Men talked, too, about Harry Harding, a youth with a hawk's nose and a hawk's pride, who looked at Elaine as if she were a ladder. Catelyn held the letter and felt the empty space where Sansa's face should be, and then, like a shard of flint striking dry tinder, she felt heat. Arya was here. A child had been born. A boy she might yet claim was on a rock island with a wolf who looked like night. She could not have everything. The gods had told her the first time she had held a babe. She had not believed them then. She had thought, greedy, that she might pick and keep. Now she believed. Still she counted. Roose Bolton wrote from Harrenhal in a careful hand that made every letter look like a man at attention. The letter said nothing that could be used to hang its writer. It spoke of weather and highways and minor lords' temperaments with the precise apathy of a man counting flies. It closed with the formulae men use when they do not mean them. Catelyn set it down and warmed her fingers at the brazier and did not talk about the feel of old leather behind the words. The Blackfish only shook his head once and said, "He will not come at us like a storm. He will come like water that quietly rots the pilings of a pier. We must not spend too much time looking at the horizon. We must look down and see where our feet will fall through." Ramsay Snow did not write. He painted, with men's blood, on small towns' doors, sigils that meant nothing except winter with teeth. The Blackfish followed the stains like a huntsman and laid his lines, and Ramsay, clever as a fox and twice as hungry, went where the lines narrowed. It should have taken longer. In the end, what undid him was the simplest thing. A bitch in heat, a kennelman's haste, a whisper in a girl's ear that made her put a ribbon on a latch just so. The Blackfish's men took him from a bed he had made into a throne, flayedskins doing duty for a canopy. They did not flay him. They bound him, gagged him, and broke his wrists. When they brought him through Winterfell's gate, the yard went very quiet and then savage with its breath. The she-wolf at Arya's knee made a low sound that came from old, dark places. Theon Greyjoy walked behind Ramsay, slow, careful with every step as if the ground might break under him. He looked at Robb and then looked away. His hair was thin. His face was not. It had become a map of what men can do to each other when they are allowed to study too long. He went to his knees without anyone telling him and pressed his forehead to stone. When he spoke, the words were a stranger's, hoarse and careful. "I am sorry," he said, and it was like a man cutting his own throat with a spoon and finding it takes more time than he had thought. Catelyn stood very still. She had hated Theon hard and brittle. She had recited the names of the boys buried in a shallow hole under a tree and put him among the things she could not forgive. Now she looked at him and saw not a prince of anything but a piece of driftwood, all edges worn away, still wood, still what it was when cut from a tree, but so changed by water and sand that you could not put it back, and it would not hold a nail. She heard a sound and realized it was Arya's breath pulling sharp and fast through her nose. She put out her hand blindly and found Arya's wrist and closed her fingers around it. Arya jerked once, twice, and then was still. "Take him to a warm cell," Robb said. "With food. With a blanket." Some men muttered. One of them had the nerve to speak it. "Your Grace." "He knows more of the Iron Islands than anyone here," Robb said flat. "And he knows what my house looks like, inside with a knife in it. There is some use in a man like that." He looked at Theon, and his eyes were not kind, only clear. Use is not mercy, he said to him. Do not mistake me. When Asha came, days later, she came with knives worn like daughters, close and attended to. She had a laugh like en or against water and looked at the world with approval only when it did something violent and efficient. She inclined her head to Robb as if he were a captain she might consider obeying under weather. And then she saw Theon and the world did something loud that no one heard. She swallowed it. Her mouth tightened. I didn't come to beg for him, she said before anyone could ask. I came to kill him or plan with you for killing his uncle. Either suits me. You might do both if you're nimble, the great Jon said, and something like a smile flicked Asha's mouth. They spoke that night of Euron Greyjoy and of black sails stitched with madness. Asha did not ask for forgiveness for her brother. Forgiveness was for priests and for men who liked how they looked in a mirror. She asked for ships and bread and the promise that the North would not set fires on every strand if the Ironborn came to harbor without a flag of smoke in their hands. Robb promised what he could, which was little and large. Do not come to steal, he said. Come to buy and sell, and I will not make war on you will. There is war enough in the world. You speak like a man who knows the true thing and pretends to bargain over the rest, Asha observed. Good. I prefer business to vows. She glanced toward the tower where Theon slept. He may still be of some use as a stick to prod the kraken with, or as bait. You tell me which when your taste is sure. Not bait, Robb said. He did not look at Catelyn. We have had enough of that. A stick, perhaps. Sansa baked a pie in the Vale that did not collapse. She did it with flour she measured herself and with fingers that had learned the trick of turning dough without waking its temper. The septa made a small noise of pleasure when she laid it on the table. Peter Baelish smiled a thin smile that wanted to be a different shape. He spoke to men at the high end of the board with a voice that tucked sharpness like a knife into soft bread. Harry Harding bowed over Elaine's hand and spoke of hawks and of how the air tastes different on your tongue when the mountain is deciding if it will let you pass. That night, a message came wrapped in a well-washed scrap of linen with a fish stitched in blue thread at the corner, no more than the length of a finger. Sansa read it by the light of a lamp strangled to an inch of wick. The word was a single name, and it was not hers. Arya, it said. She lives. She did not cry. She put the scrap under her pillow, and in the morning she fed it to a fire and watched the way the flame took it. Slow at the edges, quick in the middle, a small flare of brightness like hope is. She drank watered wine and laughed when the boy Robert coughed too hard and then looked proud of himself for stopping. She watched Littlefinger watch her and made her eyes say stone. She began to plan how the Vale's castles might learn a new song. Beyond the wall, things moved that had learned to move in a world that had rarely asked anything of them. Jon Snow sent men where there were gaps and held where there were teeth. He spoke with Tormund Giantsbane in a language that was mostly laughter and anger and learned when to lead and when to let Tormund do it with his voice like a fallen oak. He sent Sam away east like a mother bird pushes a chick with love's beak too hard and hates herself for it after. He ordered dragonglass napped by men who had never thought to be flint workers and watched their thumbs cut and heal and cut again. He wrote letters to Winterfell that smelled of pitch and hope. Robb wrote back in a hand that had become more economical with the war. They spoke in ink of things men rarely speak of face to face. How much fear is good when you give it to men, how much makes them brittle. How long you can keep a man in the cold before his bones get ideas. How to make food stretch by teaching the mouth to savor. When Hardhome burned, the smoke could not find its way over the wall, but the knowledge of it did. Jon snuffed the candle in his cell with thumb and finger and saw the ghost of the flame when he blinked. Stannis counted what he had spent and did not call it loss. He called it used. Davos, crossing cold water with a boy and a wild woman and a wolf who did not think much of boats, counted waves and opportunities, and called it all luck as if the word could be made to mean something other than chance by being said enough times. When Davos came back to White Harbor with Rickon Stark at his shoulder and Osha at his other, his beard salt-streaked and his hands a map of cold, Wyman Manderley had all the bells rung, even the old cracked one that only made a sound like a cough. He met the boy in the square and went to one knee, and it was not graceful, but it was sincere, which matters more. The people cried, and Rickon looked around him as if measuring. The wolf stood with its hackles raised only halfway and did not bite anyone, which was a beginning. Wyman fed them with both hands. Hot spiced wine, fish cooked in cream, bread with butter that ran. He spoke privately to Davos after, wine overfull in his cup. "You have done what most men would have called impossible," he said. "We will find a way to call it merely hard, so that other men will not like to think we have owed you too much." "I don't mind debt," Davos said. "I mind forgetting." "The North remembers," Wyman said softly. "Ask your king if he needs reminding. Ask the men he will send south, if he ever thinks of that again." His gaze turned toward the sea, and for a moment he looked very old. "The sea remembers nothing," he said. "It writes old stories over every morning. It is honest in that way." Winterfell took Rickon like a house takes a gust of wind. It shuddered, it dropped soot, the doors banged, the fire jumped, and then it settled, knowing itself better for the gust. Catelyn embraced the boy hard enough to make him grunt and then held him away and looked at him, really looked, at the wildness of him, at the grief that had grown into his bones fierce, at the line of jaw that made her heart pinch. Arya stood back and watched, eyes bright with something that was not jealousy and not pity and not entirely joy. It was relief, perhaps, the sort of relief that hurts because you have been holding your breath so long you forgot there was air that didn't taste of burning. Shaggy Dog took the yard as if he had paid for it. Grey Wind watched him with the detached interest of an older creature who has seen stupid choices and does not plan to be nearby when they are made. The she-wolf kept her distance and bared her teeth once just to establish something that wolves establish with less hurt than men do. Ramsay Snow was hanged at dawn on the third day after he was brought to Winterfell. It was not done in the yard where men ate or trained. It was done outside the east gate, against the hard blue of a morning that would not take a cloud for company. Robb stood and watched. He did not speak. He did not enjoy the work. When the rope took weight, Brynden Tully watched the line taut and then Oakschlick. He looked at Catelyn. He did not smile. There are creatures a man kills and counts himself better for it. There are others he kills and feels worse. Ramsay was the second kind. Justice was still done. When it was over, the body was cut down and burned. The ash blew soft across the snow like dirty rain. "Some men would flay him to teach a lesson," the great Jon said afterward, half a question. "The lesson is learned," Robb said. "If we need to teach it again, we are poor teachers." The message went south over fields that would not grow for months. The bastard of Bolton was dead by a clean rope. Roose Bolton folded the letter into his vest and went and stood, for a long time, looking at a wall that had once been black and now was more different kinds of black than a painter could name. He breathed, and you could not tell if it were satisfaction or the relief of a man who has seen a complicated plan put out of its misery. He wrote nothing back. He began, instead, to carry his light steps farther south along roads that had learned to be blurred by armies. On the day the ravens came from King's Landing with gossip that smelled of perfumed rot, Cersei imprisoned by the faith, the Tyrells playing piety like a long game, Marjorie's innocence a coin to be flipped under 3 cups. Catelyn walked with Rosalind along the wall walk and rested an elbow on the crenellation and laughed. It was not kind laughter. It washed something out of her mouth that she had wanted to spit for months. Rosalind looked up at her, startled, and then put a hand over her own mouth and joined her, the sound startling out of her like birds. When they were done, Catelyn wiped her eyes with her glove and said, "I have never enjoyed a woman's misfortune. Today I do. The world must forgive me." "The world has enjoyed ours," Rosalind said, and the two of them stood shoulder to shoulder and felt the cold and let themselves be unladylike in a way that did not matter and mattered completely. "It will not end there," Catelyn said when they were quiet. "It will fester. That city is made for that." "It is far," Rosalind said, hand going automatically to her belly even though Lyanna slept downstairs with a nurse who swore like a sailor and rocked like a boat. "How can a far thing make us cold?" "Because winter is far and makes us cold," Catelyn said. "There are distances that have no meaning." She thought of Sansa and of the Vale's hard stone. She thought of Littlefinger and of how men can turn kindness into currency. She thought of a child's soft head and counted again. There were battles, small ones that moved like foxes through hedgerows. A band of whites at a ford that used to be a place boys dared each other to jump and now was a place men died. An ironborn raid at a small northern cove that cut 3 fishers and took 2 girls and lost 5 men to a woman who threw a pot of boiling turnips because it was the thing in her hand. A meeting with a clutch of free folk who had been taught by the land to trust nothing that walked on 2 legs and learned to trust the voice of a Stark again when it told them. There is a fire and a wall and bread. There were meetings that looked like war and were not, because someone spoke or someone remembered a face at the right moment. There were days that felt like reprieves and nights that felt like debts coming due. In the Godswood, Catelyn pressed her palm to the heart tree and listened to what the wind had to say about men who think and wolves who don't. The tree did not answer, but the snow did. It pattered off the leaves like fingers. "Keep him," she said, "to gods or wind or wood. Keep them. Let me lay down something heavy that is not a child. Let me be tired and still be useful." Arya returned from the second patrol out of Last Hearth with her she-wolf matted with blood, not her own, and a new scar along the meat of her palm where a white's fingers had scraped. She had the particular light in her eyes that comes when a person has done something they did not know they could do and is deciding which part of themselves to love for it and which to fear. She did not brag. She told the story like a weather report. She went to the forge and watched the blacksmith fit a strip of boiled leather to the handle of her spear and made a face when he suggested a bigger hand guard. "Do you plan to put your hand in its mouth again?" he asked, amused under his soot. "If I do, I will bite back," she said. And he snorted and patted her shoulder and went on with his work. Rickon shadowed her for a day and then peeled off, as boys will, when something shinier caught his light. He had a lesson with a scribe who tried very hard not to be afraid of the wolf under the table and failed with grace. He came back to the yard at dusk and threw his arms around his sister and spoke into her cloak. "I dreamt of Bran," he said, voice thin and fierce. "He has a bird in his head." "Good," Arya said, too fast because her own heart jumped like a fish. "He always liked birds." "He is a tree," Rickon said, annoyed at being misunderstood. "He made the snow stop." "Then let him," Arya said, "because there are some places even wolves cannot go." When the sky finally broke into ordinary weather for a week and the ice that had shouldered against Eve's side and fell in sheets, Robb stood with his hands on the parapet and watched meltwater make lines in the dirt of the yard and thought of other lines. Supply lines, lines of men, lines of words that could be said and unsaid. He had gray at his temples that had not been there when he had ridden to the Twins. He had learned the trick of not speaking until men had begun to think perhaps they had said something wrong. He had learned the trick of being wrong and making it look like a change of plan and not an error. He had learned that a king may be a man who makes fewer mistakes than others and pays for them quickly. Gray Wind leaned against his leg. The dire wolf watched everything. With the discourtesy of a creature that is not impressed by men. Robb rubbed behind his ear where the fur lay thin and felt the rumble of his animal's mind like thunder a very long way off. "Do you ever wish you were back in the yard at Winterfell with a wooden sword and a boy's idea of honor?" Catelyn asked, stepping up beside him, cloak slung back, the wind lifting a strand of hair along her cheek like a painter's brush. Robb did not answer at once. He followed with his eyes the path of a trickle of water carving a rut. "I do not remember who that boy was," he said at last. "He might have been a story I told myself. He would not have liked me much." "He would have loved you," Catelyn said. "He would have argued, and then he would have loved you. Boys are allowed to be fools. Men must be careful where they put their foolishness." He smiled then, quick, and looked like the boy for a breath. "Rosalind says I am very foolish with Lyanna," he said, "that I let her hold my finger too much." "Then be very foolish about that," Catelyn said. "Spend it there and not at a table with knives on it." He sobered and nodded. "A letter from Stannis came in the last Raven," he said. "He wishes to speak again. He says he has learned something that will make us both miserable and necessary." "Then you should go," Catelyn said, "and come back with a plan that does not eat all our bread." "And you will run Winterfell," Robb said, half jest and mostly not. "I will do the work that feels like running," she returned, and watched the yard with him. watched the way water moved off stone after a long freeze, the way the world remembers its flexibility when it must. 2 nights later, under a moon that had made up its mind to be blunt and full and not in the mood for poetry, a horn sounded from the east wall. It was not the long, low moan of alarm. It was a call for attention without panic. The sound the North taught its children early, so that their hearts would not tear themselves to pieces at every echo. Men moved. Women moved too, the ones whose work in a siege is as important as any man's. Counting grain, rolling bandages, heating water. Catelyn went to the battlement and stood beside the Blackfish and squinted into the distance where the white of a line of men does not show itself easily. It was Stannis, his banners tight against their poles, his men in order that looked like a sermon. The king's face was thinner still, his hair a whisper. Davos stood near him, his eyes going up once, not to the walls, but to the windows where light leaked like secrets. He saw what he had come to see. Winterfell had men in it who were not going to eat each other to live. He exhaled. When they came in, the bread and salt were offered, the guest right taken. The hall swelled with men who did not sing. Stannis did not waste breath. Dragonstone's caches of dragonglass are larger than we thought, he said to Robb when they stood across a table that had been polished smooth by worry. There is a load under the mountain that will keep knives in men's hands for 3 winters. I have sent for it all. We will need ships and men and patience to bring it up the narrow sea without the Kraken taking an interest. We have some of those things, Robb said. All of them would be better. Ask your fat lord with the ships to keep his promises, Stannis said. Ask your sister in the Vale to keep her mountains quiet a while longer. Ask your wolves to stop singing when men need to sleep. They sing when we need to stay awake, Robb said mildly. Stannis stared at him for a long breath and then made a sound that might have been a grudging acknowledgement. We will not argue titles tonight, he said. We will argue quantities. How many men can you send to the wall without making this place into a song about ruin? Robb counted in his head, the numbers like arrows, each with a point. 200 now, he said. 400 more as the road's firm. Bread to pay for them I can send with. Meat will need to be hunted or bought from men who will charge us dearly and be within their rights. We will pay, Stannis said. In coin if we must. In other ways if we are clever. I will not let the wall fall because a butcher likes silver better than survival. You may find that butchers have learned too much politics from queens, Davos murmured, and Stannis gave him a look that said do not jape when the timber is being cut. There is more, Stannis added, almost as an afterthought, as if the words might be less heavy if he threw them casually. A raven from the citadel. A girl across the sea does not only have dragons. She has learned to keep a city from eating itself. She has learned, too, that breaking chains does not break hunger. She will come if she can. The wind will decide if she comes in time. Robb looked toward the fire. In the corner, Lyanna mewled in her nurse's arms. A small assertion that she existed and would not be forgotten. Then let her come if she can, he said. We will do what we can while we wait for stories to grow wings. Catelyn excused herself and slipped from the hall into the cold. She walked to the Godswood in a night that knew how to be quiet even with 2 kings breathing under one roof. The heart tree stood with its new leaves dark against the star-dusted sky. She pressed her palm to its bark and let her breath go out and did not hold the next too quickly. Let me not make mistakes I cannot mend, she said simply. Let me fail only where the failing might teach, and not where it might kill. The wind rose and laid itself down. Somewhere in the distance a wolf sang once, twice, and then fell silent as if not to wake a child. The world held. It would for a time. Then it would not. Then it would again because men would make it. In the morning, the yard was a frenzy of people with sense, which is what you want in a yard. Stannis's men sharpened their order against Winterfell's disorder and shaved it smooth. Davos stood with Wyman Manderly and spoke ships and storms and how much salt to pack with fish if you wanted it to make port looking like food and not bait. Arya led a file of scouts out the east gate at a long dog trot, the she-wolf tracking Frost and the faint ghosts of Prince. Rickon watched her go with a look that was all fire and no patience. Rosalind sat with Lyanna and counted her own breath in and out of small lungs. The blackfish taught a young umber to see the difference between a drift and a rampart in white light. The great John broke a man's nose in a friendly way and then bounded himself with clumsy gentleness. Men laughed. Men cursed. Men did not sing. There would be a time to sing or not. Not now. Toward noon, a rider came from the south, horse-blown and rime-flecked. He was a Frey, fifth son of a second wife's fifth boy, lined like a map of bad habits. He bore a letter with Lord Walder's crackling crabbed script and a face arranged to look like someone else's fault. Robb read it standing and handed it to Catelyn without a word. Walder wrote of age and the way it made a man think of his soul. He wrote of bridges and bargains. He wrote a postscript in a different hand, likely a favored grandson's. Black Walder was dead, lame Lothar missing. There were rumors of pies, the postscript said. Lies, wicked, slanderous tales unfitting to set to parchment. House Frey considers itself wronged by such japes. Catelyn read and did not smile. She thought of Wyman's private feast and of his slow, careful chewing, and of the way he had looked at her afterward as if asking forgiveness for something he would never confess. She thought, too, of guest right and the weight of bread and salt. She thought of how hard it is to keep a people's soul clean when it is asked to hold too much blood. "We will answer this?" Robb asked. "With courtesy," she said. "With distance. With a guard at the bridge," he said. "With grey wind scenting every cart," she returned, and the dire wolf lifted his head as if his name were meat and came to his feet, great and inevitable as winter. The day went on. The days went on. Winter, which had come like a king and then like a siege, learned to be domesticated for a time. Men made lists. Women made bread. Children learned to step around wakes. Plans were laid that no man would have believed a year before. Shipments of dragonglass to be hauled up rivers that had not known such cargo since the dawn. Boats to be loaned and paid for not with coin but with promises that looked like coin if you polished them with hope. Meetings with free folk in groves where men had never met before except to fight. Words drawn carefully out as if they were stones from a river you could not see the bottom of. And always, under everything, the sound of wolves. Not constant, not trying to be a song, a presence, rather, as old as hunger and as faithful as a hearth. Catelyn came to love it in a way that was not simple. It reminded her that the world was not a thing she could teach her own sense to and expect the world to be obedient. It reminded her that there are things that live because they are alive, not because men make reasons for them. On a morning when the light had a little more gold in it than anyone had thought possible, Arya came in through the gate with her hair stiff with frost and her eyes wider than fear allows. People turned to look at her without quite knowing why, as birds turn their heads all at once when a wind shifts. She went straight to Robb and spoke 5 words into his ear. He did not move while she did. When she finished, he was in motion before the words had settled into the air, walking fast, gray wind picking up his feet as if the ground might bite. Catelyn felt the shape of something change without seeing it yet. "Tell me," she said to Arya, and Arya swallowed and said it in a voice that had learned to keep its strength for when it mattered. "A rider with white eyes," she said, "and words like stones. A bird on his shoulder, dead and still looking. He came to Last Hearth and did not ask for bread. He said the night is coming down the road and does not care for walls. He said the dead have learned to run. Then we must learn to stop them moving," the blackfish said, already hardening, already laying down lines in his head. "We will," Robb said. "We will learn fast." Stannis's mouth became that flat line again. Sometimes it was as comforting as a straight blade. "I have knelt to nothing I did not intend to rise and kill," he said. "I will not kneel to cold. My men will march at dusk." "And mine," Robb said. "And mine," echoed in different voices from different corners, like a chorus that had decided to learn the same tune at last. Catelyn did not pray. She had prayed much and well. There is a time for praying, and there is a time for the work that makes prayer something other than a sigh. She put her hand on Rosalind's shoulder. She kissed Lyanna's head. She drew Arya to her and pressed their brows together so that their eyes looked at the same small point of dark. "Come back," she said, which was a good magic, though it is not often the sort that makes the world obey. They went out of the gate in a long line that caught the light like a vein of or in rock. The snow had crusted, and boots cracked it. Winds drove small ripples across the white that looked almost like a sea if you stood and stared and let yourself be fooled. Gray wind loped along the flank of the column like a moving shadow. Shaggy went ahead and came back and went ahead again with the arrogance of the young. The she-wolf ranged wide where men would not. The world waited. Then it moved. What came out of the trees did not howl. It did not rattle. It did not wear malice like a banner. It came the way cold comes. It simply was there where it had not been, and the shape of things changed around it. Men who had learned to fight men knew immediately they were underdressed in the soul. They lifted their spears anyway. The first ranks went down and got up wrong, and Arya's breath went in once like a knife and out like a song, and she found the seam between bones and aimed for it with a spear point that had learned the idea of not breaking. Fire took and ran and did not care what names men had given each other. Dragonglass did dark work that felt cleaner than steel after. Stannis's men held step and step. The free folk who had come south to live learned that living and fighting were not different verbs. Jon Snow was not there. He sent orders through air and ice, and they were good orders, and men obeyed them because they had learned this voice and respected it even when they did not like the words. Robb moved where the line was thinnest like a stitch that saves a seam, and when his arm tired, he used the other, and when that tired he found he could lift, because other men saw him lift and felt shame if they did not. The Blackfish put his back to Robb's once, and the old man laughed, sharp and short, as if to remind himself what his ribs were for. Asha Greyjoy fought like a woman who has something to prove to a god she doesn't think much of. When it was done, she spat and said, "I'd rather fight waves," and then coughed until she leaned on her axe and grinned. Stannis did not grin. You felt his grimness like a shelter to get under. Catelyn did not see the battle. Her work was inside walls, and she did it without flourishes. She took bandages and made them where there were none. She kept a boy from running out into the yard with his shirt unfastened and his heart broken because he had seen a man fall who had laughed with him the day before. She fetched water and did not slop it. She told a story to a child shivering under a table about a fish that learned to swim backward so it could see where it had been and not be ashamed. She allowed a woman to cry and did not tell her to stop. She ate a heel of bread standing up and discovered it was the best meal she had had in a month. When the night lay down at last and did not crack its eyes again for another try, men counted. They counted each other. They counted arrows. They counted breaths they had not expected to still be taking. They burned the dead. They did it without ceremony and with reverence. The smell lifted and spoke the language of necessary things. Children in Wintertown, who had been taught by their grandmothers not to stand with their mouths open when smoke passed, closed them obediently and stared with hard new eyes. Robb came back into the yard at gray light, stairs crusted with blood and ice, hair stiff. Gray wind came with him, flanks heaving. Robb took the stairs not fast and not slow and went straight to the Godswood and stood looking at the heart tree as if it held a mirror for him none could see. Catelyn followed at a distance and did not intrude on whatever words he gave to the wood. She stood with her hands folded between muff and sleeve and heard, faint and fine, perhaps imagined, perhaps not, the sound of leaves answering with nothing so grand as a prophecy or a blessing. A rustle, a noise like knitting, work. He turned finally and came to her, and they stood for a long time and watched the way the day decided to be itself after a night that had tried on too many shapes. "We held," he said, and his voice was hoarse and soft, and that was enough. He did not say we won. "No one runs the snow," Catelyn said. "Not for long. We will need more fire," he said. "More knives of the right sort. More men who can stand and not run when the world is wrong. More bread. I will count what we have," she said. "I will ask what we do not." He smiled at that small old smile that made her want to put a blanket over his shoulders and feed him broth in a chipped bowl and tell him to sleep. He would not. There was no room in this story for the luxury of sleep. Men would sleep when they fell. They would get up, those who could, and do the work. They would love what they had time to love, and they would teach their children to hold knives right and to make bread and to hear wolves and not always be afraid. The sky had a thin blue to it when she left him. Rosalind waited in the doorway with Lyanna warm and drowsy in her shawl, and when she saw Robb she lifted the baby and he put his hand on his daughter's head and closed his eyes, and that gesture was a kind of victory no song will ever get right. Arya came in with a streak of soot on her cheek and a grin that went away when she saw the stretcher behind the men. She did not look long. She came to Catelyn instead and said nothing and took her place at her side, where she had fit once as a little girl giving her mother a handful of acorns and asking if that was dinner. Sansa sang in the Vale that day, or maybe she spoke in a voice that made men think of singing. She said words that made the Lords Declarant sit and listen and think about the way the river runs under ice all winter without making a fuss about it. Davos stood on a pier and counted ships and decided which he could trust and which would founder in a wind with an ego. Wyman Manderley measured flour with his massive hands and told a joke about a kraken that made a whore blush and a Septon smile against his will. Jon Snow stood on the wall and felt it breathe under him and thought of a sister's laugh he had not heard in years and scent. In a raven's small mind and strong wings, more words down a road that connected with blood and with frost. Beyond all of them, a girl sat on a high seat in a city with dust in its teeth and learned again that ruling is a winter of a different color. Her dragons turned their heads toward the west and blew smoke that smelled like hunger. In Winterfell, the men slept in their gear and the women slept in their dresses and the children slept with their hands in fists, and for a few hours the world consented to be quiet. The wolves did not sing. The trees said nothing. The stars did. What stars do. They looked indifferent and faithful. Catelyn, lying awake with her eyes on the dark, counted again. Husband gone, sons lost and found, daughters scattered and gathered. A new child breathing in a world that wanted all breath. She counted and made the numbers make a kind of sense that could be used, that could be wielded. When she slept at last, she dreamed of bread rising. It was a good dream. In it, she could feel the warmth of the oven, the way the dough yielded and then came back under her palms, alive, stubborn and promising. She woke with that promise like a taste in her mouth and went to work.